All right, y'all are good to go.
Okay. Uh, Hi. My name is Nadine Saliba. I'm a board member of the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our conversation on Palestine. The Israeli military pummeled the Gaza Strip for 11 days and nights before a ceasefire was finally announced. The round of Israeli attacks killed 248 Palestinians, including 66 children. 13 entire families were wiped out, close to 2,000 people have been injured, and upward of 50,000 were displaced. Over 15,000 homes were either completely destroyed or damaged. Israel also destroyed Gaza's only coronavirus testing lab. The ceasefire ends the massacre by airstrikes, but the massacre by other means continues. The ceasefire stops the bombs for now, but it doesn't stop the forced ethnic displacement underway in Sheikh Jarrah. It doesn't stop settlement expansion, land confiscation, water theft, child incarceration, and it sure as hell doesn't end the siege of Gaza. In 2012, the UN issued a report warning that Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020. Well, we are in the year 2021, and Gaza has been uninhabitable for a while. More than half of its million residents live below the poverty line and have no access to safe, clean water, electricity, and sanitation resources. It's time to end the siege, to open all the crossings, to lift the restrictions on medical supplies and other goods. It's time for Palestinians in Gaza to be able to travel, to have more than the minimum number of calories and grams of food calculated by Israel to avoid starvation, but still result in malnutrition, which is easier to slip under the radar of human rights organizations. Israel and the US government were probably taken aback by the massive demonstrations in Palestine and around the world against Israel's criminal military campaign. They probably think a ceasefire will placate the people who have organized and protested and taken action in support of Palestinians and the people in Palestine who have done that themselves, uh, facing much, much higher risks. We must disappoint them. We must continue the pressure, continue to organize and protest and speak out and do all we can to make sure that after the ceasefire, things don't simply go back to normal. With us tonight to discuss what's happening in Palestine is a panel of three young Palestinian Americans. They are Ahmed Qaqi, Maureen Qaqi, and Lama Hantash. Please feel free to post any questions you may have in the comments, and our panelists will be more than happy to address them. The first question to our panel. The impending forced displacement of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah fueled tensions in Jerusalem and led to the most recent developments. Can you please talk about that? Anybody can jump in, and after they're done, other people can jump in too.
Cool, I can start. So Sheikh Jarrah has to be understood in a broader context, right? First off, the majority of families in Sheikh Jarrah that are under threat of eviction or better yet, forced expulsion are families that arrived in Sheikh Jarrah as refugees after they were removed from their homes in Palestine in 1948. Other families have been there for generations. Israel's framing of this issue is one, I think they called it a real estate dispute. And the reason for that framing is because a real estate dispute happens in every city, in every country across the world every day. So why focus on us? Why make a big deal about this? But that's not the reality. Apartheid contributes to what's happening over there because the expectations for what Palestinians need to present in order to have homes is different than what as Jewish Israeli people need to present in order to sustain their homes anywhere in the occupied territories. So the most concise way to describe what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is a continuation of the ethnic cleansing that began in 1948. Now, ethnic cleansing is a phrase that's used a lot, but what exactly does that mean? It means that Israel seeks to replace Palestinian Arabs with Jewish Israelis in order to kind of reinforce their demographic stronghold on areas. I think one of our best definitions came from a settler himself, right? The famous Yaqub from the United States, who replaced a Palestinian who lived in that home and said, well, if I'm not going to do it, somebody else is going to. And when pressed on the matter further in an interview later on, he insisted that we're not trying to get Arabs out, we're trying to bring Jews in. And the interviewer asked him, said, well, like, bring them in where though? He's like, well, yeah, in Arab homes. So that's what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. It's the insistent and continued ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And the response to that globally has been in an effort to stop that. The pressure has worked to some degree insofar as the courts have had to delay that. And there's been pressure from even moderate American politicians as far as seeing that as a very obvious injustice and obvious what exactly is bad is happening in that moment.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for that very thorough response to the question and necessary context. To Ahmed's point, to expand on one of Ahmed's points that he made about using the language of eviction, right? They'll legitimize that by making the claim that, well, this was the conclusion of what happened in an Israeli court. But what we have to remember, excuse me, my voice is a little bit hoarse from yesterday's rally. But what we have to remember is that the state has no jurisdiction over this when we're looking at this in a colonial context. So that's why we bring in these frameworks. These aren't just, I know we hear these words a lot and they tend to be used as buzzwords, and sometimes we don't necessarily know what they mean, but it's explicitly important to frame this in a settler colonial context, because that's what that word implies by with what Ahmed was talking about, with the removal of Palestinian Arabs to make way for Israeli Jewish settlers, or Jewish settlers from non-Israel, wherever they may be from the world. So that's one of the things that we have to recognize, is that this language of courts is not legitimate, right? It's not, that doesn't validate what is happening. This is merely one tactic in many that are used as a process of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, right? I'll let Lema add anything she'd like.
Yeah, no, thank you both, Ahmed, for that brilliant overview, and Maureen for that important analysis of the mechanisms by which this settler colonialism is being executed. That's something I want to go a little bit more into right now, just to give anyone watching who doesn't really know the situation so intimately a bit more context, to say that essentially, like Ahmed mentioned, many of the families facing eviction were refugees from the Nakba in 1948. Who, in exchange for denying their refugee status, which is a strategic move by the state of Israel in order to kind of limit the Palestinian identity, as well as their claim to a grievance being refugees and like asylum seekers, and noting and therefore kind of buffering the claims of Palestinians against the state of Israel that they've been displaced and that they have a right of return. But anyway, so basically the state of Israel brokered a deal with Jordan, who is in charge of pretty much all of the West Bank and including East Jerusalem from 48 to around 67. And the deal, the stipulation of the deal said that that these refugees would be allowed to live in Sheikh Jarrah, that they would be made citizens of East Jerusalem and would be allowed to have land rights indefinitely. Unfortunately, Jordan lost control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, but several courts later upheld the legitimacy of the deals made under Jordan's tenure. And so these land rights are ostensibly valid in terms of international law. But what Israeli settlers have done is filed a lawsuit in Israeli courts alleging that this land belonged to Jewish people thousands of years ago and therefore is now should be Jewish owned. And so it is trying to nullify the claims of these Palestinian refugees in Sheikh Jarrah. people have actually gone and found like documentation, thorough documentation from, I believe it was Ankara, where there was like a library of old records that kind of proves that like, no, this land has actually been like Arab land for like a very, very long time. And there's no actual record of Jewish ownership, like in the time periods they're citing. Still, Israeli courts threw that out. Democracy at work. And then the case now for Sheikh Jarrah is being waged upon the idea that Israeli courts in, I believe, the 60s said that the Jordan agreement would be upheld. So essentially, the court systems are all just like at the hem and haw of the Jewish settlers, and are pretty much just doing any kind of like mental maneuvering, trickery, legal trickery they can do to nullify the claims of the Sheikh Jarrah Palestinian families who have been there for decades and are now just being forced out of their homes. And this is really important to talk about, just because like one of the main arguments you'll hear about the necessity of keeping Israeli autonomy in the region is that, oh, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, none of these things sound very democratic. None of these court systems sound like they like appeal to the sensibilities of like the most disenfranchised members of society, and instead are just in the pockets of people who are determined to enact the regime of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing that Maureen and Ahmed talked about.
Thank you, Lama. And there's, of course, the issue that these settler organizations are funded by American nonprofits in many cases. And, you know, the role of the US government and, you know, is something that will come up, I think, during the course of the event, but in relation to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, it's important to point that out. And that you know, that when the majority of Palestinians inside Palestine and all over the world who are refugees and have deeds to homes and lands, if they go show them to any Israeli court, of course, it will not allow them to go back and live or claim these lands and homes. Okay. We wanted also, another question I had was to discuss the different narratives about Gaza, of what we hear in the mainstream media and the corporate mainstream media, based usually very heavily on Israeli propaganda, and what many of our politicians parrot, versus what Palestinians experience in reality. So if anyone again can jump in.
I believe you're on mute.
I always do that. I don't know how. I've been using Zoom for this long and I still can't get it down. I was saying I'll go ahead and start on this one if that's all right with y'all, but it seems like I already have. So yeah, one of the biggest things I want to talk about is, of course, Gaza is not a monolith, right? This is an area of nearly 2 million Palestinians, mostly composed of mostly refugees, right? And they're constantly remade refugees within even that small radius that they're currently in because of Israel's subsequent bombing of Gaza, right? But that's another conversation. So the point I want to make is that there are multitudes of narratives to be made out of Gaza, but one of the ones I do want to touch up on in relation to like the U.S. mainstream and how Gaza is perceived, of course, is Hamas. Hamas, of course, is classified by the U.S. Government as a terrorist organization. They really are classified. I mean, first let me recommend Tariq Bakoni's book on Hamas. I'll have to get the title, and if anybody knows it, please jump in. But they are, as the name implies, it's an Islamic resistance movement that was born in 1987. Hamas is often seen as like, I mean, it's not seen, it's in the media, they tell you, right? Israel makes it clear that they view Gazans as terrorists because they group them in with Hamas terrorists when they say that this is how many people that they've killed today. And really what I'm trying to get at is this notion that Hamas was born as a resistance movement to Israel's occupation and colonialism and colonialism. And that now I'm going to ask you to jump in here real quick, please.
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to discussion of narratives, let me give an example. Yesterday we had our protest here in San Antonio, which was fantastic. You get to share space with like-minded people and express solidarity with people who are struggling in Gaza and Palestine, and join this freedom movement, right? And anybody who's been to a protest knows that there's agitators, and then there's kind of people who linger after protests and come by to ask questions, but they already have an idea of what they want to ask, what they want to discuss, what your response is going to be, etc. So this guy came up to us yesterday, and the first thing that he discussed is Hamas, which is why that's the first thing that Maureen mentioned, because when it comes to narratives, in any situation, they're the first thing that's brought up. So for me, when I'm discussing what's happening in Palestine, I actually like to avoid talking about Hamas as much as possible, because Hamas isn't the reason why things happen, right? Israel began existing, declared existence over historic Palestine in 1948. Hamas came into existence in 1987. To describe them as a sort of cause and effect, where Hamas does something and Israel does something in response, is extremely irresponsible, misleading, and it's just a flat out lie, right? For example, when it comes to narratives in this particular instance where Israel killed over 200 Palestinians, then you'll often hear the lead being that Hamas fired rockets into Israel, which is true, but Hamas didn't fire rockets into Israel without context. What happened in Sheikh Jarrah happened. Palestinian worshippers being attacked at Aqsa happened. Protesters were attacked by Israeli settlers. There were people who were killed, brutalized by Israeli police. And all of that context needs to be discussed when discussing, including Hamas's rockets, everything else that happens. So Hamas, in my opinion, is an afterthought, because with regards to discussing how this happens, you have one side that has a extremely well-funded military with precision airstrikes. And the irony of precision airstrikes killing children shouldn't be lost on anybody, because they're precise and they're intentional. Being compared to a militarized group in Gaza that fires off indiscriminate rockets, the comparison doesn't hold up at all, right? Other things that aren't discussed in regards to context and narratives is the blockade that's happening in Gaza. And the realities of the blockade are intense. Israel's blockaded Gaza since 2007. During that blockade, it's extremely difficult to get in or out of Gaza. In fact, the basic standards is extreme conditions or scenarios, usually medicinal ones. Electricity, as of today, is cut down to 4 hours a day. Over 95% of fresh water in Gaza is undrinkable. And all of this is because of a brutal military blockade that the Israeli government has laid down on Gaza for the last 14 years. So again, discussing Hamas's actions or discussing what Israel does in Gaza without discussing the greater context of the blockade, the occupation, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is really what we try to get at when we discuss why narratives matter here.
Yeah, I appreciate you stepping in and helping me out with that, Ahmed. And to that point, that's the only reason I wanted to bring it up, is because I feel like people often it scares them to even talk about it, right? And when we talk about it in this way, right, and contextualize it like you're calling for, that's when it makes it easier for people to sort of control this situation, because it can be so easy to get swept up in this whole war on terror propaganda, especially when we're talking in the mainstream about Palestine, right? And people will get very nervous when you say, "Oh, forget Hamas," and they're like, "Oh, what do you mean you don't care about like a terrorist organization?" It's like, okay, dude, but like this is what I'm trying to explain, right? This is not the reason this started, like you said, was not because of Hamas. Hamas began in 1987. Israel began ethnically cleansing Palestinians 40 years before that. And so, yeah, I'll go ahead and let Lama chime in.
Yeah, thank you both for that really helpful context. And I think it's really important to note that asymmetric power imbalances that Ahmed mentioned are like the reason for the asymmetric narrative imbalances that we see going forward, in which the actions of Hamas are universally denounced as being, like terrorist threats to civilians, when the two largest terrorist organizations in the world, the United States military and the Israeli military, are largely forgotten in this talk of civilian casualties and civilian targeting. And a huge reason for that, or a huge reason that it's far easier for us to contextualize Hamas as terrorists, but not as the Israeli military and the American military, not only because of the so perceived legitimacy of a state conferred to Israel and the United States, but not to Hamas, given their status as a non-state organization in international relations, as well as just like by the international community generally. But also because of the narrative framing of states like the United States and Israel, which are determined to portray Arabs generally as the culprits behind terrorism. They have no problem saying that Iran, a Middle Eastern organization, not Arab, but within the region, is also it funds Hamas and is therefore funding terrorism. And yet the fact that Israel is actually largely responsible for the foundation of Hamas by its supplying of weapons and other resources, as like weapons, money, and other resources to the ideological precursors to Hamas, in order to embed further discord between the Islamist groups and the leftist groups in Palestine in the 1980s. Does not get Israel decried as a terrorist funder because, again, it does not fit with the narratives being portrayed of Islamic terror being the one and only issue to face like the world. So to me, like anytime we talk about terrorism or state-sponsored terrorism or otherwise, the issue is like concentrations of power. Those organizations which concentrate power most aggressively and centralize it most deeply are the ones who are usually responsible for the greatest amount of terror. And for that, we have to look at large organizations like the United States and Israel, not to small rocket-powered like tangents like Hamas.
Yeah, and Lama brought up a really good point there, which is discussing specifically the narrative behind Hamas being an Islamic terror group and how Israel plays very deeply into that, because they know from an American context how terrifying it is when you've got dudes with their faces wrapped and the Arabic calligraphy strapped across their foreheads. That's another part of the narrative, and Israel plays a role in how Islam is perceived in the West. And they feed on that in using Hamas as the base point for which they discuss the conflict. But Lama really nailed it on the head when discussing asymmetry of power here. And that's what it's all about. And every conversation about Palestine and Israel needs to start from that point. There's the oppressor and the oppressed.
And Ahmed, I think it's worth elaborating on your point too of the reliance on Islamophobia here, because when we talk about Zionism, I don't think we talk about enough on a genuine reliance of the settler colonial framework on Islamophobia and this war on terror rhetoric that operates not just between the United States and Israel, but China is picking up on this war on terror rhetoric also, and has arms deals and weapons deals with Israel as well. And there are other major states that do this. So, I mean, this is a global issue, right? And this image of this demonized image of Islam, it creates a sort of, I mean, I'm sure somebody much smarter than me has come up with terms for these things, but it creates these biases in people's minds that automatically make the Middle East in general worthy of just being bombed, right? And that's and that also contributes to this whole, oh, they've been fighting for thousands of years kind of thing. This is religious. So all of these narratives work together to help produce and set the context to make this information really palatable in a way that it appeals to the public, right? And it works, and we see it work, but now the tides are changing.
Yeah, exactly. And war on terror rhetoric runs deep, right? I mean, Nadine and Iman and I were discussing this before you guys hopped on. What does Bashar al-Assad call folks before he drops a bomb on their building in Ghouta or Halab, right? He calls them terrorists. We know how effective that narrative and that framework is. And the fact of the matter is, and this isn't in an effort to kind of like play victim here, is that Islamophobia is generally acceptable in public narratives, right? There's been a huge outcry against anti-Semitism, and in case it needs to be announced, it doesn't, but in case it needs to be announced, we're all firmly against anti-Semitism. But the fact of the matter is that Zionist organizations in the United States are far more responsible for Islamophobia than Palestinian organizations in the United States are responsible for anti-Semitism. But one form of racism is acceptable and the other isn't. And Israel understands this when they feed the narrative of what's happening in Gaza.
And something that I think is like particularly like true of the Palestinian issue, like compared to like other maybe states in the region, is that like Palestine really is not like an Islamic issue by any means, and it just gets framed as such, despite the fact that so many Palestinians are Christian. As many were Jewish, as well as a few other religions that like exist inside, like like the hotbed of all like Western religion, like Jerusalem. And the fact that like some of our greatest like Palestinian like freedom fighters and heroes, poets and everything were like Christian is completely just like slid under the rug, because it doesn't fit with the traditional narrative of this is all jihad, like this is all like an effort by Muslims to try and take over the West, like from like its most important like religious stronghold, and like that starts by taking it from the Jewish people, and then they're coming out to Western Europe for the Christians too. And it's just like overtly silly, but has real salience because of the isolation of like incidents of Islamic terror, like in being upheld as like the bastions of like this is what terrorism looks like, this is what terrorism is, as opposed to like the routine bombing of civilian structures in Gaza by Israel, like that just gets held as like self-defense, and like Israel like having the right to defend itself. So always how we talk about this is really super critical for how people's perception like carries forward, and what their immediate like knee-jerk reaction to is when they hear, well, there's fighting in Palestine, Israel again. If they've been bombarded with like Israeli or Hamas militants, send 4,000 rockets across the border to Israel, and then while Israeli defense reactions kill 200 people. Like it's like, okay, like yeah, I know what I'm gonna think going forward.
I don't know how we left Israel's right to defend itself out of a conversation about narratives. And again, pick up your average New York Times report or Washington Post, and these are liberal American media outlets, and they're going to frame it passively or otherwise based on who's firing the rockets and who the victims are. Exactly as Lema said, right? Like in Gaza, X number of people died, while in Israel, X number of people were killed by this group. It's very intentional.
Wow. And nothing about just like Israel has the right to defend itself, but but Israel is occupying another people, and under international law, people have the right to resist occupation, including armed struggle.
Absolutely.
That is never or rarely ever included in the analysis.
I just want to go back to the idea that the fact that you can say a state has rights is ridiculous. Like if people don't have rights, how can a state have rights? It's just a horrible framing for anything, and especially a framing for the justification of an ethnic cleansing.
Right. Absolutely. And it's interesting that Israel, for example, BDS activists will do BDS. And Israel will complain, oh, why is Israel being targeted for its human rights violations? Essentially, that's the complaint, right? And it's the same idea of exceptionalism. Like why does Israel have a right to exist over any other state? It doesn't, because states don't have a right to exist. Again, to Lema's point, people do.
And the narrative of a state has rights that human beings don't. I remember when even on a domestic, like even in quote unquote regular countries with states and supposed democracies, this is used against citizens. I remember when Trump started separating families, and most people were appalled, and the justification was like, you know, when they, even regular citizens, when they imprison the parents, they're separated from the children, you know, that's normal things that states do. All states do that, you know, as if that makes it acceptable. It's just putting up states as, you know, having rights, legitimate rights, is a total used for basically to dominate citizens and people and human beings, even without the context of occupation and colonialism. So, and I'm old enough to remember that when, you know, before Hamas became the primary group within among Palestinians, when the PLO was the boogeyman and Fatah. So they're just going to use anybody that's that becomes convenient. Okay, thank you, guys. Another other question is, which I pointed to a little bit in my introduction, about the ceasefire. And I know a lot of people are relieved that, you know, there is a ceasefire and Gazans aren't being bombarded, but we want to unpack that idea a little bit further, and what it means. You know, for Israelis, a ceasefire means going back to normal life. But what does it mean for Palestinians?
I would say that, I mean, I would also contextualize it and say, for the most part, even when you know, things are ramping up in Gaza, when Israel ramps things up in Gaza, I should say, that for the most part, Israelis are still generally in like their normal lives. There are times where they get sent to bomb shelters and stuff like that, but their lives are not disrupted nearly, even in the process of it, nearly in the same way that Palestinians are and Gazans are. And now, again, that doesn't justify untargeted attacks on civilians here, but that is not the primary issue at hand, right? That's not causing the most amount of deaths, nor is it the source issue. But the point is that even though there's a ceasefire, apartheid continues. The disenfranchisement of Palestinian Arab within Israel continues. The Palestinians in the diaspora still don't have the right of return with the ceasefire. Basically, the only thing that's changed is that there are currently not bombs raining on Gaza, right? But that doesn't mean that people are not still dying from lack of infrastructure, malnutrition. I mean, there are in access to water, healthcare. I mean, I don't even know. It's basically like asking the question of what's wrong with everyone from the West Bank to Gaza, right? Like, this is a big question because there's everything. And I'm sure my much more intelligent friends here will give more nuanced answers.
Well, I reject that description first and foremost. To hammer home Maureen's point, the advent of social media has really been something in contextualizing what the actual war before the ceasefire means for each side. A big popular thing to do was to go to Snapchat maps, right? And click on an area in Tel Aviv to see what people are snapping about over there, right? What kind of pictures are they sending? They're sending good times at the beach or at lunch, or, as Maureen said, generally living life normally. And in Gaza, it was pictures of destruction, because that's what Israel does in Gaza. They destroy. And so while there are inconveniences generally created by Hamas rockets, inconveniences can't be compared to what Gazans go through. And with the ending of the ceasefire does not come the ending of a blockade, right? And the blockade serves a purpose of making sure that the damage done during the bombs continues, right? Because when you destroy thousands of buildings and then you don't allow the construction material to rebuild the buildings in through the blockade, you're ensuring that the economy of Gaza remains devastated, that people can't rebuild their homes, their apartment complexes, their businesses, or whatever it may be. So a ceasefire, like Maureen said, may mean that people are no longer dying because bombs are being rained over their head, but they're affected in many other ways by the blockade. And of course, obviously, the continuous things that are happening in the West Bank. And so, yeah, I mean, and until until Palestinians are granted all of the rights that Maureen discussed, the ceasefire only means that that's stopped for now. And even then, that's in between. There were between 2014 and 2021, the last two kind of wars. If you look at the timeline between then, dozens of Palestinians in Gaza, if not more, have been killed in the protests in 2018, 2019. Dozens of Palestinians were killed. So the violence doesn't stop ceasefires, not for Palestinians.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything that was said before. And I just want to make note also that Israel has like a very vested interest in making the violence it incurs seem both sporadic and provoked, neither of which is true. This is a very like calculated, routine, and targeted endeavor that they undergo, in which like the process they call it is mowing the grass, in which basically they will every few years or so, once things have kind of been like a little quieter as far as like ethnic cleansing just being like, oh, like soldiers killed 12 like residents today, as a residents today, just like on their walk, like that's normal, that's all well and good, but like we need those hundreds, we need those, we need the bigger numbers to put them on the board. And so we're gonna like do a provocation, either like threaten to evict people from their houses, just like escalate something at the border like they did with like annexing like more land and stuff in 2014. Whatever it is, that will like cause like Hamas to like start sending rockets, which are obviously intercepted by the Iron Dome that the United States paid for. They won't pay for anything for Gaza, despite all of the casualties that they're suffering, but like whatever. And then as soon as like the rockets are fired, then it's like a free for all to carpet bomb the Gaza Strip. And this process, which has been noted like by Israeli military officials as being called like mowing the grass, is intended to give Israel a chance every couple of years or so to decimate the Gaza's population and also its infrastructure in order to ensure that no viable Palestinian state ever arises therein or in the West Bank. The West Bank's being handled because through the establishment of the border wall that's going to divide and conquer the region, as well as the separate areas which are under the purview of the Israeli military in like A and B, and then C is like still under like Israeli control through the checkpoint system. But Gaza technically, as of 2005, is autonomous and does not have the Israeli military present, which basically means that Israeli military people were pretty much tired of just like being inside like a very like depleted like wasteland of a territory where they were just like being bombed all the time. So they were just like, oh, okay, psych, like we can like pull out, but we're just gonna have to bomb you every couple of years or so to make sure that like order is restored and your population is low. It's one of the things that we didn't talk about in terms of narrative, which comes up way too often, is that as soon as you say like, oh, there's an ethnic cleansing in Palestine, or there's a genocide going on in Palestine, according to the UN definition of these terms, people will tell you, oh no, there can't be an ethnic cleansing or a genocide because the Palestinian population is doubling. And it's like, you're counting us? Like you're sitting here just like counting heads, and that's your justification for when like 200 people were just killed yesterday. You're like, no, it's fine because you're giving birth so much. Like, that's ridiculous. That's insane. And like all of this squares with a very segmented and routine process by which Israel is just trying to keep our numbers down, like artificially through murder.
As is happening in Jerusalem as we speak. Okay. Do you see any parallels between what's happening in Palestine and what happens here in the US and in Texas along the border, with issues from settler colonialism to evictions and home demolitions, police brutality, child detention, displacement and gentrification, and so on? I know that, for example, Maureen and Ahmad were very active in the when protests were going on in Carrizo Springs, and regarding when family separations and under the Trump administration. if you.
Yeah. And it continues, of course, under the Biden admin, and it started under the Obama admin. But yeah, lots of similarities between living in Texas and living in Palestine, right? First and foremost, of course, one of the most visible, I think, is the border wall. I think that was stated along the southern U.S. border, the U.S.-Mexico border. Things like checkpoints, right? Policing, and we'll get a little bit more into these things. But from all of these things, there are associations between the U.S. and Israel in these industries, right? Broadly, these have to do with like security industries, cyber industries. These are where you'll see sort of the products of where the overlaps come in, right? So tech is another one, but cybersecurity, I think I said that, but tech. For example, what's the name of the company, y'all? I'm horrible with like remembering specific names of the company that one of the companies that helped to build the U.S.-Mexico border wall and the border wall in Palestine.
Elbit.
Yes, and yes, and so like, and then there's, for example, G4S Security, I think, which has some connection with the U.S.-Mexico border. I can't remember if it's CBP. They're complicit somehow. Again, I'm very bad at this, but there are websites and resources. If you go to the BDS, they'll have this much better laid out than I do. But police brutality is another one. It's not. It's also, so if y'all remember when the migrant caravans, as they were called, the folks coming across the U.S.-Mexico border were hit with tear gas by U.S. forces, and that same tear gas was hit on Palestinians. So there are literal like pieces of technology that connect people who are oppressed in Palestine and people who are oppressed here in Texas, the U.S. broadly, right? Because some of these tactics are expanded outside of Texas, especially with regards to police brutality, actually all of these, because the border wall runs past Texas too, right? But yeah, I'll leave space for fellow panelists to add some more here.
Lemma, you're off mute, so I didn't know if you were going to say something.
No, I just like never mute myself. Because not as familiar with San Antonio.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add with what Maureen said. Companies that were contracted, or the companies that built the border wall in the West Bank, were contracted here in the United States by U.S. Customs Border Protection. It's hard not to, from just a purely like just looking at the images of children in detention, not think of Palestinian children in detention, which is a very real problem there, that children can be scooped up from the villages and cities that they live up in Palestine and end up in Israeli jails without access to legal representation, without a word to their parents on what's happening. And one thing that stuck out to me in particular with kind of like the increased exposure of children in detention facilities is when I lived in Palestine, I'll never forget that there was a public radio station that was set up by a Palestinian who used it as a way for parents to try to connect to their children who were in Israel, under Israeli detention. And what I mean by that was they didn't get phone calls or get to send their parents messages or anything like that. So as an attempt for these parents to communicate with their kids, they would call into this radio station in hopes that their kids may be able to hear it. So just the kind of the memory of that and that coming up when discussing that, that won't escape me. So child detention is very real here and there, and those oppressive structures exist in states all around the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm a bit less familiar with the San Antonio context, but I can say that like all across the United States, one of the most salient connections between the apartheid regime in Israel and the American like police state has been the routine training of like local U.S. Police forces with the Israeli military, which is like an insane concept to have like a police and a military trained side by side. Obviously, like we recognize that like the police is a like a militarized like entity already in the United States. But ostensibly, like the point of the police is to be like community getting together to like enforce safety amongst ourselves. And so like so clearly that is not happening. And when I was in Durham, North Carolina, that's where I went to school. I was part of an initiative called Demilitarize Durham, Palestine, which assembled a broad coalition of several different like local community organizations with different like backgrounds, affiliations, who were just committed to trying to reduce the militarization of the police force in Durham. And we were able to actually be the first city in the United States to end police exchanges with the Israeli military and all foreign militaries by means of a city council resolution. And of course, like despite this very, very hefty like win for Black and brown communities who were being like over policed and terrorized in Durham, using tactics like stereotyping, like extra like hyper surveillance, even like using like high grade weaponry like skunk spray, which is like this like spray that's supposed to like linger like a scent within you like for like hours, basically like a tear gas style thing. And just like all these tactics that they'd learned from the Israeli military. And so like generally the community was very happy about this, except of course the Zionist lobby in Durham, which very actively and to this day continues to try and overturn this piece of legislation, which does not target Israel in any specific way. It just says that the Durham military or the Durham police will not train with foreign militaries. And so you see how kind of like the infrastructure of like of Zionism is like expressly targeted to like oppress like Black, brown, and like low income indigenous communities here in the United States, because it is a supremacist organization or like a supremacist ideology that will ally itself with any right-wing cause that gives it like the credence to continue its kind of smear campaign against Palestinians. So you just kind of see like those material and cultural and narrative coalition between like right-wing forces here in the United States and like the right-wing backers of Zionism more broadly.
Thank you so much, Lemma, for that really, really great background. I do want to say that because you said you weren't familiar with San Antonio, Bexar County Sheriff's Department did participate in this exchange. It was some years ago now, but they were involved, absolutely. Yeah, and one of the things I want to say, and I would be remiss to say, is especially as an abolitionist, is that prison, I mean, prison in and of itself really isn't scrutinized, in my opinion, very much as a tactic, right? Like the idea of getting arrested as at a protest isn't scrutinized enough. Ahmed and I were arrested in Carrizo Springs 2019, 2 years ago, July 2019, right? I think. And it was after CBP and the Dimmitt County Sheriff's Department and Carrizo Springs Police Department were basically just like instigating the crap out of these protesters for no reason, all that context. But the point is that like we were arrested there, held for 24 hours, and it was sheer community support that got us out as soon as we did, because we were arrested on July 3rd, so before the holiday, and then after the holiday it was going to be the weekend. So if we really didn't have community members calling in and like seriously pressuring local officials, and thank y'all again so much for that, for our release, we would not have gotten out in the time that we did. And I don't know if this is a typical structure, but the Dimmitt County Sheriff's like jail was more like a prison structure in the way they had it held, right? Not like a holding communal jail cell type thing for temporary. And so these are psychological tactics. And this is why I'm an abolitionist, because these are problematic things that are used from Palestine to here to suppress people, right? To scare you from protesting and from advocating for your rights. And yes, y'all, protesting and holding rallies and stuff, that's not the process of liberation, but it's where we meet folks like one another and how we build the energy and support as a community to be able to do the work that gets there. And so when we bow to pressures of policing intimidation, even if it's threat of being arrested, we're giving into that, right? And so I want to emphasize that. And it's not, again, it's not talked about enough, because one of the responses to like me and Ahmed getting arrested was like, and it came from mostly like very privileged folks, but it was like, oh, isn't that good for like, activists? Like, isn't that like good in your reputation of circles? And I'm like, these people, I just told them that like, I spent 24 hours in jail not knowing when I was going to get out. It's my mom's birthday. And like, I'm freaking out. I peed myself after I got tased twice. And their response is, isn't it good for like my CV? And I'm like, dude, I don't care about my CV. So it's like, we have to have these conversations seriously, right? That's my point here. But yeah, thank you for that space to say that.
Absolutely. And speaking of walls, this latest operation by Israel was called Guardian of the Walls. Like they continue giving us metaphors, and the language in itself is a sea to dive into. Finally, is what do you think? What regular people can do right now to help? And especially as people living in the United States, with the role that our government plays, it's Israel's #1 backer, gives it the weapons that it uses to kill Palestinians, and the shift in public opinion, hopefully, that perhaps is taking place. So whatever you guys want to touch on.
Yeah, I think honestly, public opinion is immensely powerful tool in this country. Like, of course, like we talk a lot about like Zionists and other powerful, like important lobbies, like having all of like the financial resources or whatever, like to sway congressional opinion or like other levels of like governmental opinion. But at the end of the day, the reason like politicians like want campaign funds is not because like they siphon them or anything. It's because like they think that campaign funds like equals votes. And if we say like our votes are directly and intrinsically tied to Palestinian human rights, then like, okay, goodbye campaign funds from Zionists. Like that's not at all what we're interested in, because they care about entrenching their own power. And so obviously that's like a problematic framework, and we'll work on that at another day. But right now, like while Palestinians are like, actively being bombarded and like are like under threat of like annihilation and obliteration, then it is very important that we like wield our voices. And that's what I think is so critical about this moment, is that I saw somebody phrase it this way, and I don't know like how accurate it is or whatever, but so I saw somebody say like, oh, like Palestinians won Twitter this time. And it was like, well, actually, yeah, like for the first time, it's like the like woke or like progressive or whatever, like the TikTok trendy thing, to like question the state of Israel and like kind of show some kind of sympathy for Palestinians who have been like waging this struggle for centuries or like decades at this point. And you see that translated into real results with the like 6 or so Congress people like standing on the floor of the House saying like, and the Senate as well, like saying like Palestinians deserve rights. And like, it's like, whoa, that's crazy. I never thought I'd hear that in Congress. Like that's like a huge milestone, even if it didn't necessarily translate yet into like material recourse for the state of Israel. It is still a huge narrative shift that signals, like greater change to come. And that will only happen if we continue to put the pressure on politicians, especially those we know might be more pliant. And so like what people can do, like in my opinion, is to continue to show up to demonstrations, to continue tweeting, like Facebooking, whatever, having conversations with the people they know and with the people they don't, and also with like your representatives, because there's plenty of email tools and stuff that you can just like literally like click a link and then it will send like all the emails, text, whatever on your behalf. Like it's very low like stakes commitment, but it makes a huge impact from the perspective of the congressional advocates. Once they see like, oh, like 20,000 people sent me that they care about Palestine today. That's weird. Like maybe I should think about that next time there's like an addendum to give Israel $20 billion for no reason. So
Ted Cruz never responds positively to my emails. I don't know why.
They don't respond to your emails.
Ted Cruz always sends back some message about Israel. I don't know what the deal is.
Well, I don't know. He seems like one that could be pushed if he got the right. Like he's gonna come with the things he likes.
The Zodiac killer's going nowhere.
Trojan butter down.
And I'm just going to continue everything amazing that Emma shared in that she talked about a handful of politicians. There's something they all have in common, right? From Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Mark Buchan, Betty McCollum, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, is that they all represent extremely progressive districts, right? And so, like Lemma said, sure there's a lobby, but they're above all beholden to their constituents, and so we are responsible for holding politicians to at least basic decency. I've expressed a bit of optimism because I actually have noticed, from my perspective, that they've gone beyond basic decency. In the past, you'll hear like blah 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 blah, Hamas rockets, blah blah blah, Israel's right to defend itself, and then blah blah blah, something about a Palestinian state, right? But for some of these people, especially the amazing Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush, describing Israel as an apartheid state, and then saying, I mean, I was taken aback when I read this. AOC posted on Twitter, Israel is an apartheid state. Apartheid states can't be democracies. I mean, that's like a sitting member of Congress saying Israel isn't a democracy. I mean, holy crap, that's crazy. And I think that's reason to be optimistic about where the movement is headed. Like Lemma said, we won Twitter. It's a silly thing to say, but it forces people to talk about this, and it forces it the next time that it's debated on a national stage. I think it's going to sound a little different than it did the previous time that it did. Right, because now we need to have conversations about Israel as an apartheid state, about Palestinians' right to self-determination, about holding Israel responsible for what they do, and so on and so forth. So we need to wield our power as people in whatever way possible, and that means holding politicians responsible. That means attending demonstrations. That means engaging in boycotting Israeli products. And a side note on boycotts, it drives me nuts every time I see that giant graph with 8,000 companies on it. That's like, boycott all of these companies like Starbucks and Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Frito-Lay. And sure, there's a reason probably to boycott all those companies. But if you go to the BDS movement's website, they have very specific campaigns targeted at companies that usually operate in settlements or do something in coordination with the Israeli military. Sabra Hummus, SodaStream in the past, which was very, very effective. Right now, it's like HP and Intel, Ben and Jerry's, who like to feign social responsibility, but have a manufacturing plant in a settlement, right? So those are the things that we can do. Wield our power as consumers in a capitalist state, as well as voters in a representative democracy, to push our elected officials in the right direction.
I appreciate you both for the great sort of ideas on how folks can move forward. If you're, I second absolutely everything that they said here, and I mean, we know that there's only so much that we can achieve through this kind of framework, but it's one tactic, right? And one of the things I will ask people specifically too is uplifting Palestinian voices is making sure that we are uplifting the narratives that Palestinians are putting forth is fundamentally important. And I'll give you an example of why. And all of this is intentional, and I'm grateful to people who come out in solidarity of Palestine. And this is not at all meant to be like a criticism if you've taken this approach before, because it has its use, but it also has its limitations. And this is why it's important to deploy like multiple modes of resistance, right? But one of the things is framing the discourse as if this is strictly like a human rights issue, right? Like, yes, we need to talk about, especially when the bombs are raining over Gaza, how many people died today and who died, and you know, why these things, because these are people that matter. But beyond that, when you don't put it in these contexts, like we've been talking about, these political contexts of power analyses, like Lemma brought up earlier, of settler colonialism in a broader context, of the international community's complicity and role in this, right? And contextualizing it that way, when we leave those things out and we just make it a story about human beings, yes, that is an important humanization, but you're making it absent, you're making the presentation of our narrative absent and devoid of a political path forward. And so that's why it's fundamental that we use these contexts and that we bring these up, not just, so humanize us, yes. Look at our beautiful culture. Learn Debka with us. Come play the tabla. Please, I'll have you over for dinner. I love nothing more than to share Palestinian food. I learned to garden as a practice of Palestinian resistance. These are all beautiful aspects of our culture that we want. Call Chnafa Palestinian, right? Call hummus Palestinian, because it's not Israeli. It never was Israeli. It existed before the state of Israel was even ever conceptualized. But yes, these things do matter because there are multiple ways that we resist. And by being Palestinian, when your identity is being attacked in ways that people are trying to say that you don't exist or don't deserve to exist, then existence is a form of resistance. And we exist in a multitude of ways, not simply just as survivors of oppression, but as a people with a beautiful culture and a beautiful history and a deep, deep love for life. And we display it in so many ways that we love to show.
Thank you for that, Maureen. That was like a spoken word poem. That was so beautiful.
Y'all are my inspiration.
We have some questions from the chat, which I think some of you saw. The first question was about the organizations that the US nonprofits I mentioned that fund some of the settler organizations that are in Israel in general, but especially those that we've been seeing with the Sheikh Jarrah. I think Maureen mentions in the comment, I don't have anything, I just read like some of the articles that were written about it. So I can, if we Google it, I'm sure we'll get some information, but I don't have specific names to name.
If I post, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Nadeem, but if I post a link to the Intercept, and because the Intercept article did something on this, if I post that link, will it be accessible to folks? How does that work?
I think so, should be.
Let me put it in our chat here and I'll see how that goes.
It'll automatically create a hyperlink when you post it in there. But yeah, Alex Kane wrote a great article about that. If that's the Intercept one.
Yes, yeah, that's
listed out.
Okay. And
it has more direct answers, better than I could give you. I don't know about Lama if she's comfortable with this one, but
the second question, what about, I think, international law? Do you think that international law provides a sturdy and effective framework for a resolution to this?
If it's okay, I'm going to start this one. I'll say international law and its framework is rooted in colonialism because those are the hegemonic powers in the international community. And international law and framework is what got Palestine into the situation that it's in because of its reliance, again, on settler colonialism. For those who don't know, like the brief history, right? The United Nations voted to partition Palestinian land and voted to partition it unfairly. And people like to start at that point, but I like to back up because I don't know what right the UN had to partition our land in the first place. You know what I mean? Like that's where the conversation needs to start. And so in my opinion, the international community has failed dramatically. Noura Arakat wrote a phenomenal book on the legal framework that has been exploited, the international legal framework that Israel and the US actively have exploited to perpetuate the things they have. And she obviously presents a much more nuanced understanding of that. And that's from, again, specifically a legal framework. But in regards to the international community, and until we see power less concentrated within states, and especially states who are already hegemonic within that context, I don't think the international community is reliable in that sense. But on the plus side, with the connections that the internet has brought people like the people of these states globally, I do think that that as an international framework of organizing and approaching it that way, virtually even, is a huge benefit to the movement and what we've seen, right? I mean, we can even having somebody like folks from Sheikh Jarrah being able to hop on Twitter and actively present their narrative and be in community with people globally is one of the way that the international community of people, not states, right, do succeed, I think.
I want to mention before any of you jump in that with the partition, when the United Nations did the partition of Palestine, that my understanding is that the majority of member states, speaking of colonialism, most third world countries were still under colonization, so they were not independent countries and members of the UN. My understanding is this is one reason why they were able to pass that partition, because the UN member states were predominantly Western and European colonial powers. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And I don't have too much to add to what Maureen said, besides when it comes to the United Nations, the power to execute is concentrated within the Security Council, right? And the Security Council is made up of exactly what Maureen said, these hegemonic imperial states, and they will constantly defend their allies ad infinitum. So for every attempt to hold Israel responsible at the Security Council, there will be an American veto, much like we see with other things, right? Russia doing the same thing in defense of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, right? So we'll continue to see that. And so long as power is concentrated in the Security Council, I'm not sure if there is a framework within international law for Palestinians to seek justice and peace.
Yeah, I really have nothing to add to that other than that international law appears to be what side of the bed Joe Biden wakes up on any given morning. Like, I don't really think that such a thing exists outside of, like, you know, United States, like what they're feeling. So I don't see a path forward until, like, the American public does. Then we can talk.
Someone on YouTube who attended yesterday's protests asked, are there any activist groups or links I can use to get involved?
Locally, if they're in San Antonio, it's Jewish Voice for Peace is the predominant organizing group. A lot of people ask, you have to be Jewish. As a non-Jewish member of Jewish Voice for Peace, I'd like to answer that question. No, you don't have to be Jewish. In fact, you can be Muslim or like whatever else. Just great. The folks who are organizing with Jewish Voice for Peace have been organizing locally in San Antonio for Palestine for the better part of 15-ish years, since I was a wee boy. So that's a trustworthy organization with it's a strong national organization that has a good group of folks organizing locally.
Yeah, and I think just like as far as like other ways to get involved, you can always sign on to like organizations like the United States Campaign for Palestinian Rights, FOSNA, which is FOSNA, and an Allah Justice Project. I'll try and like drop the names of these in the chat, but they all have like listservs that you can subscribe to that send out like almost weekly. Even right now, like it's definitely daily action asks where they'll like just like tell you like, here's like a tweet that you could just like post and like bubble, you know, like go, or like here's a list of protests in your area, like go, you know. So those I find very helpful if you're trying to find more like digital advocacy or like more nationwide stuff. So I'll put those names in the chat.
Thank you, Lama. Does mobilizing by allies to end the blockade? Does mobilizing by allies to end the blockade have strong support globally?
I'm not entirely sure. I'll say this, that the blockade is such a flagrant violation of human rights that it's a very easy thing to focus on as far as one of the things that Israel does that violates Palestinian human rights. You know, you've seen in the past these flotillas that go to Gaza as an attempt to bring kind of resources in and things like that. So I think that there is, of course, there is globally a lot of support for ending the blockade, but the question is, are the right people putting pressure? That's the pressure that's necessary for that to happen.
Also, it's like, allies. Like who are they? Because the Arabs out there, like they're not doing so hot. I think Kuwait just did something nice for once, but like I mean, like it was just like matching funds. Like okay, great. So like there's just like there's a lot of non-aligned movement countries, we'll say, who like are very like vocal and supportive like of Palestine, but like they have like limited international like currency compared to like the United States and France and Great Britain and everybody who is like BFFs with Israel. So it like that's just like not necessarily to me like a feasible like again move forward without like broader like grassroots momentum.
With all love and solidarity and respect to the folks who care about this movement, we need to do more. We need to make sure that Palestine is the same way that we hold these like sort of domestic conversations to our politicians and have standards about how like the line that we pick, like this is it. Palestine needs to be on that side of the line, y'all. That's how we get to that point, because again, to their point, morally it's easy to be opposed to this, but that needs to translate into action, and that comes by people putting pressure, and it can't just be in moments like this. Moments like this are where it gets hot and maybe a bunch of new people know, and we open up ourselves to like teaching in this moment and explaining and expanding and absorbing that momentum and then using it to push forward and continue, right? Until Palestine is free.
Can you talk about medical apartheid? Israel is refusing to vaccinate Palestinians as it boasts about vaccinating most Israelis, and as mainstream media brag about that fact. And not only they refuse to vaccinate Palestinians, they're not allowing, as far as I know, of course, some subjects die and we stop hearing about it because something else worse happens, but they're preventing Palestinians from importing vaccines from somebody else. So if anybody wants to talk about that issue.
Yeah, I believe like there was like a moment where Palestinians were trying to buy like Russian vaccines, and like Israel's like they're lost in translation, like we don't speak Russian right now, which is like whether or not that's true, it's out there. But like Israel does have a very long and documented history of medical apartheid, and this is just like one obvious branch that like when a global pandemic happens, Israel's gonna like look at opportunity to continue to its campaign of like ethnic cleansing and like on all frontiers, including medical. So like really like medical apartheid looks very different from like the West Bank and Gaza, because like Gaza, like they just have like absolutely nothing. Like for example, the vaccine needs to be kept at like below a certain temperature in order to like stay viable. And like as like Ahmed said, like doesn't have electricity for like 40% of the day. So it's like if they get a shipment of vaccines in the morning, like they better be using them by lunchtime or else it's over, because like come night, like there's not going to be a refrigerator to store the vaccines. So like medical apartheid is like executed in a variety of very like nuanced ways in the Gaza Strip in particular. Like where just like resources just don't exist, and like because of the blockade and like because of the bombing, because of everything. Meanwhile, like in the West Bank, it's like the checkpoint system really is like the most major barrier to Palestinians like having like medical access, because it's like the West Bank is like, with the exception of a few major cities, like a bunch of disparate villages, and so like there are not going to be like hospitals with like ample resources in each of those villages. So you probably need to go, like if you're in some place like Abu Dis, like outside of Jerusalem, you're going to need to go to like a more major city like Ramallah to get to give birth, let's say. But if you want to go there, you have to cross a checkpoint. Whether or not you make it across that checkpoint is like just about like, if the soldier who's manning it decides like he wants to let you through that day. And there are plenty of documented cases of ambulances having people with like perfectly treatable conditions having Palestinians die in the back just because like they were stopped at checkpoints for too long to make it to the hospital. And like and then you have to get permits and stuff to go to Israeli hospitals, which obviously have like better equipment and technology and all that stuff. So really like medical apartheid is enacted in various ways, and just like we are not surprised at all by like the fact that they decided to do so with the vaccines as well. Not open to anybody else.
Yeah. Exactly as Lema said, and the vaccines are a continuation of a history of medical apartheid. And to elaborate on our previous discussion on the uselessness of international law states that the occupier is responsible to provide in these situations to stop the spread of contagious disease. And Israel obviously doesn't fulfill that responsibility, which just comes back to who's executing international law and holding states responsible.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I actually don't have anything to add. Those are very thorough, wonderful answers.
On top of obvious settler politics, what role has housing speculation or gentrification played in Sheikh Jarrah? From my understanding, this has been a long-running legal battle, but only recently has come to a head.
I would say that it's like using gentrification as a framework is helpful to understand it from like an American context, but it's not exactly the same thing. So like the frame of this question kind of like requires an answer that addresses more specifically the fact that this isn't solely about like class politics or something like that you might describe gentrification as. Obviously gentrification is racial capitalism. There's like plenty of like racialized elements to it, but in Palestine it's almost exclusively racial, with the class element just being linked to the fact that like Palestinians are like deprived state resources and like in any kind of like means of survival, and then like Jewish citizens of Israel like are given enough things to actually viably survive. And so like the class component is just kind of secondary to being like Israeli and like i.e. being non-Palestinian. And so like in like Israel's MO in general has been since the day of its inception to appropriate as much Palestinian land as possible and make it Jewish, which is why they actually like give citizenship to anyone who claims a Jewish identity. And not only do they give citizenship, but they say like, hey, like if you are Jewish and like from, you know, like the United States or Ukraine, not Ethiopia, because they'll sterilize you. But if you're from somewhere like white, then you can come on over and we'll give you like free land. And by free land, we mean like land we just like chuck the Palestinian off. And like, so that's just kind of like why we see it escalating now, I think, is just because this particular neighborhood is in East Jerusalem. Jerusalem is like the hardcorest battleground state for them. Like it's high profile, like Christians care about it. Like that's like, I mean, like that's just really what I got to tell you about it. Like is that is the issue is that Palestinians are being displaced like all over the West Bank. But you don't really see people caring as much because like, I don't mean like Palestinians are people who are sympathetic. I just mean like the international community doesn't care as much because it's not the contested like holy land. And like that, and like the reason they haven't been doing as much in Jerusalem is because like Israel knows that people are watching Jerusalem more closely. And now I think they were just like emboldened, like Biden, the Biden presidency opened a huge doorway for Zionists and Zionism in the state of Israel, because like Joe Biden stood in the halls of Congress in like the 80s or something and said, if a state of Israel didn't exist, like we'd have to create one. Like he's like the guy, like he loves them. So they were like, oh, okay, sick. Like nobody's paying attention. There's a pandemic. Like what's going on? Like we're just gonna like kick a bunch of people out of Jerusalem because like and like really just like maintain our stronghold. Since we got the big win of Jerusalem being the new capital under the Trump presidency, like let's make Sheikh Jarrah Biden's crown glory. Unfortunately for them, it didn't really work so well.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting on that, and I'm very tangential in thought, so forgive me, but I do think it's worth noting that Jerusalem has become a focus also because of course the Trump presidency, the movement of the embassy, the Biden decision to keep that there, right, and not rescind that. And the force behind that, I think, needs to be named, which is Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism has played a huge political role in the United States. And there are, there's the biggest Zionist lobby is a Christian organization, Christians United for Israel, which, if you didn't know, is based out of San Antonio's Cornerstone Church, San Antonio's own Pastor John Hagee. I have to laugh when I say his name because it's just, yeah. Yes, so there's a deep connection that San Antonio has because we are home to the largest Christian Zionist lobby in the country, and they are no small force. They had former VP Mike Pence at their 2019 national conference. Who else was there? John Bolton. I'm trying to think, but they've been massively in support of these sort of right wing policies that push this. And make no mistake, they're bipartisan because their end goal is Israel. So they're just because Trump has gone away doesn't mean that Christian Zionism as a political force has gone away, not at all. And that's definitely something that I think we'll have to keep an eye out for. And because again, I think that's what, in my opinion, I have no analysis or anything to back this, but in my opinion, I do think that's what's largely emboldened the state of Israel to move more aggressively in Jerusalem.
And I think part of it was that with the election in Israel and Netanyahu trying to attract more extremist right-wing religious fanatics to join his cabinet so that he can form a coalition. But yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Christian Zionist lobby because
I always find a way.
we should not, that's a very important point. I heard something recently about, and I think the Israeli ambassador to the US saying that they need to focus on that specifically because that's who their allies are more than Jewish Americans. Something to that effect, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, it is. And I do think that San Antonio also as a local, sort of the folks who are concerned about what's happening in our community should put this on their radar specifically, because they do things that like, for example, every year there's a night to honor Israel where they donate to Israeli nonprofits. So I'm not sure if those are going to any settlement organizations, but I wouldn't be surprised. Again, I don't know, but that's something definitely worth looking into. But that's a yearly thing that's held here in San Antonio at the church on 281 in Stone Oak, if you don't know, where they have like thousands of folks come in and like high up officials. So it is definitely something worth, if you want some sort of something to grab onto here locally, that's a good place to go, I think, and do some work.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? I don't think so. Should we go ahead and close?
I think so. I just want to say thank you all so much to you, Nadine, of course, and Iman as well, and Natalie, and everyone at the Esperanza for, holding space to make a conversation about Palestine and for having me. I'm really grateful to you all for that. It's so important. And yeah, this is it. People ask what we can do more. Thank you.
Definitely echo that. I think really important to have like a cross movement forum like this, where we're able to kind of like speak to different audiences, and we really hope that we'll see more people at future JVP events, at future Esperanza events. So thank you, Nadine and Man and Natalie, for really holding that, and also to my fellow panelists, you guys just like filling with so much knowledge and so much hope and so much like the rare pride of being Palestinian comes out in like events like these. So thank you. I can't keep in. Thank your parents for having me.
Thank you, Laman. Thank you, Nadine, Natalie, and Iman, everything they said. And thank you to the Esperanza Center, who have always held a place for Palestinians in the city of San Antonio from way back in the day when we used to sell at the market. I won't say how long ago, because I feel like that'll age me just a little bit. But thank you guys always.
And thank you, Mom. Seriously, thank you.
Thank you guys so much for coming on, because we wouldn't have an event without you. And yeah, you are truly amazing. The amount of knowledge you're able to, marshal off of the top of your heads. You are truly a pride for Palestine. And we're so fortunate to have you here in San Antonio. So thank you so much. And I also want to thank the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. What Ahmad said is true. That's how I became, part of the Buena Gente of the Esperanza. It was through an event on Palestine back in 2002, I think. And then with the Iraq war. So I want to thank them so much for, like you said, always holding a place for us. and because even we're not by nationality Palestinian, our hearts are Palestinian and Syrian and Iraqi. I see it. So, and I want to thank Natalie so much for guiding us in this event, and Iman too. Thank you.